Good afternoon, all. Who does not remember, I would like to ask you all, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union a few years later. It was the time to start a long and well-deserved geopolitical holiday, we thought, on this side of the alliance. The liberal international order had come out victorious, history had ended, so why not relax? Francis Fukuyama thought. President George H.W. Bush thought. We thought. I thought. And the comforting maxim in Europe was, as it had been since the birth of NATO in 1949, when in trouble, call the White House. As we Europeans did, by the way, in the 90s, after genocide had been committed in the Balkans. As we all know, not America's, but Europe's backyard. Fast forward now 30 years. The European Union, a financial economic giant, a political adolescent and a military pygmy, struggling with its role, realizing that holiday is over, but uncertain how to prevent becoming the nut in the geopolitical nutcracker handled by China and the United States. And the question is, what does the European to-do list look like to prevent this from happening? First of all, my recipe would be to be more tough on trade and industrial policy. When you qualify China as a systemic rival, one can argue about the systemic, but a rival China definitely is, you cannot leave it here. I can understand that the European Union Competition Commissioner, applying existing rules, blocked the Siemens-Alstom merger, but serious competition and a geopolitical level playing field demands a new and different approach to industrial policy, where so-called, quote-unquote, European giants should not be rejected out of hand. This is as relevant for the competition from China the European Union is facing as for the way our American friends operate in this domain, usually by tweet. America first, you Europeans, buy American. Think about old and new here. This is about building trains and cars, certainly, but it is as important to compete with Chinese and American digital technology and artificial intelligence. Controlling and coming up to speed with what has been dubbed the weaponization of data, both in the civilian and in the military domain, will be crucial. Let me applaud in this regard recent comments made by the chairman of the European Roundtable of Industrialists, Karl-Henrik Svalbard. I have two reasons for doing this. First of all, because of his recent plea in the Financial Times to invest more in European jobs and innovation. Secondly, because the debate about Europe's geopolitical role and weight will profit from active participation of the corporate sector. I spoke about being tough on trade. The European Union could do with some more self-confidence and self-esteem here. A market of 500 million plus, still including the United Kingdom, which has not yet finished its voluntary political suicide, a market of 500 million plus is as much in a position to tell China to abide by the rules as are the United States of America. On one condition, though, that we Europeans do not fall into the bilateral trap the Chinese and to a certain extent also the Americans under Trump are setting up for us. Why do I say this? I say this because both the Chinese and the American presidents much prefer to do business with individual nations and not with the institution European Union. And that spells danger, as we have recently seen in Italy when that country bilaterally dealt with China on the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. And we see it with President Trump, bullying Germany on a regular basis and threatening its vibrant and competitive automotive industry and export. For this reason, it is essential that the European Union develops a long-term and integrated China strategy, which is at the moment non-existing. Long-term, because China thinks in decades, not in years. Integrated, because China thinks and acts completely integrated in all its policy domains. Take BRI as an example. It is impossible to distinguish where politics end and economy begins and vice versa. And a third element worth mentioning when you develop a China strategy is China's centralism. A party which is more powerful than the state, no distinction between public and private, between state and private companies. Post-totalitarian surveillance, no individual freedoms. Ask the Uyghurs, the Turkic Muslim people in Xinjiang province. I realize that developing a comprehensive China strategy will be far from easy, but will force us to look at Europe's position in the world and the choices facing us through a more geopolitical lens. Quite a challenge for us Europeans, because we will be sailing uncharted waters, given Europe's angst for geopolitics. But remember the nutcracker. There's another leader ready to use it, and he sits in the Oval Office. President Trump is, in my view, more a symptom of the Indo-Pacific trend in United States foreign policy than a clean break with the past. But that is slightly beyond the scope of my short talk today. Where I do agree with the President Trump, and that does not happen very often, is where he castigates us Europeans for seriously neglecting our commitments in the realm of defense. The economic giant is still a military dwarf who thinks he can ring the White House doorbell whenever in trouble. And here, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union should start to take itself seriously. Yes, in a scenario which could lead to invoking Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, and you know it, an attack against one is an attack against all, I'm confident that the United States would act. But I can think of a few scenarios where the United States would rightly say, over to you guys. In other words, a European Union claiming a role amongst the big ones, which is what we should do, should be able to project hard military power when the situation so demands. And I add, in these Trumpian times, the European Union cannot afford to be tough on trade while being soft on defense, for the simple reason that the United States President links the two. We cannot tell the Americans that we Europeans are the best allies they have, which is a truism, while at the same time not being able to defend ourselves. We are facing a credibility gap here, which should be filled as soon as possible, were it only for the reason that Americans and Europeans need each other in countering China's ever-growing political and military clout. French President Macron has understood this in launching his so-called European Intervention Initiative on bringing the able and willing together to create a serious European military capability to be used when necessary. I hope that we can keep our British, or should I say English, friends fully engaged in this domain when they have the Brexit drama behind them. Same goes for Germany, which could and should have a much higher profile in the defense domain, and hopefully in other domains as well. Talking about France and Germany, I think we all realize that the European Union can only become a serious geopolitical player and actor when we hear a coordinated narrative on its functioning and its future from Paris and Berlin, which at the moment is unfortunately not the case. China and Russia, and yes, the United States of America, are ready to cash a divided Europe as a strategic prize in the 21st century great game of geopolitics we are witnessing today. It's a complex game, where we are confronted with more classic elements of territorial dominance, like the unlawful annexation of Crimea, China's so-called 9-dash line in the South China Sea, claiming sovereignty, as you know, all over this vital artery for international trade. But what has been dubbed as the geopolitics of technology, like, as I mentioned, the weaponization of data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and I say again, in both the civilian and the military domain, are, in my opinion, as much part of this great geopolitical game. And also here, Europe cannot afford to play only second violin. Why are we Europeans so behind on 5G technology that the Chinese are now in the position that they can divide Western alliances? Or, as the FT yesterday quoted Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, China is in a position to divide us on bits and bytes. Ladies and gentlemen, a cri de coeur in conclusion. In defining and securing Europe's position in the 21st century, in that world through the unique project with the European Union, we must realize that what I would call societal issues, like migration and income distribution, are as much driving risk and uncertainty as the rise of China or the tweets of the American president. The resulting dissatisfaction with the voters is, as we all know, often directed against the European project. So to prevent a situation where the Union becomes the nut in the Chinese-US cracker, defending it in the national political domain is as important as forging a coherent China policy, dealing with an assertive Russia, or trying to read the Trumpian tea leaves. Because at the end of the day, to quote the words of Tip O'Neill, a former Speaker of the US House of Representatives, at the end of the day, all politics is local. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, for those excellent introductory words. My name is Rem Korteweg. I work at the Klingendahl Institute, and it's an honor to moderate this session with 4 excellent speakers. Now, the title of our session is How to Reinforce Europe's Global Competitiveness in an Uncertain and Changing World, and I think it's a credit and to the organizers and a testament to the changing nature that Europe finds itself in, that they've invited a former NATO Secretary General to kick off this discussion. In a way, this is a panel about where we stand currently in this geopolitical and economic transition moment. And it's a great pleasure to introduce 4 speakers that will shed their light on this particular European condition. In a way, before I get to those 4 speakers and give them the word, in a way I'd like to paraphrase what you're describing, Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, as the big squeeze. The big squeeze that Europe finds itself in geopolitically, on trade issues, economically, but also perhaps politically, as we see the rise of populism and Euroscepticism in European countries forcing centrist politicians to make very difficult choices. And what I hope we are able to do in the next hour or so is to take an outside-in approach. First, look at what are the external challenges Europe faces, continuing the discussion that you started, Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, and then zooming in also on how European politics are changing and whether we can address the challenges that you so rightly lay out. So after your keynote, and I think we listened very attentively, I would now like to ask our 3 other panelists to give their short introductory responses. And first of all, I'd like to mention who our 3 speakers are. It's Reinhard Bütikofer in Frankfurt. He is a member of European Parliament for the Greens, a very well-known figure inside the European Parliament and out, very active on trade issues as well. Then I'd like to invite Ms. Michaela Markussen, the chief economist at Société Générale in Paris, to offer her perspective. And then finally, Professor Simon Hicks, professor of political science at the LSE. And so without further ado, I'd like to ask Mr. Bütikofer, continuing Mr. de Hoop Scheffer's analogy that Europe is the nut inside the Chinese-American nutcracker. How does it feel being in the nutcracker?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I must confess that I'm afraid I will be more optimistic than I might be expected to be. But I really believe that the European Union has already started to move beyond just waiting to be cracked. And I would argue that if you look at different policies that we have been pursuing vis-à-vis China, notably the anti-dumping measures that we put in place, the measures to screen sensitive foreign direct investment, the connectivity strategy, or look at the latest EU-China summit, where the European leaders managed to strike a new tone I think Europe has begun to understand that it has to get its act together and to get moving. And it has already begun moving. I would say then that Europe is better in that regard than its public image is. However, there are, of course, these external challenges, and these external challenges are exacerbated by internal divisions. Mr. de Hoop-Scheffer spoke about Italy signing an MOU with China over the Belt and Road. Well, Italy did sign that MOU, but on the other hand, Germany and France did the real deals with the Chinese. And I think it's, as often is the case, if you point your finger at somebody, three fingers are pointing back at you. So I think it is up to us to understand that all the nations have to start, and particularly the strong nations in Europe, namely Germany and France in the first rank, have to start acting as European powers and not just as representatives of a narrowly defined national economic interest. And that also applies vis-à-vis the US. I recall that last year, Mrs. Merkel went to the White House trying to convince President Trump to lower the tensions on trade. She came back empty-handed. And the same happened to President Macron. And only when President Juncker went in July, I think he succeeded. And I would consider the deal that he did with President Trump as a real stroke of genius. And he proved to the Americans and to us that Europe acting together can indeed play this role, and we're not confined to being a nutcracker, to be the nut in the cracker. But of course, we also have to play offense. And that's maybe a point I would like to add to what the SecGen said about where we have to look. I believe that an activist European policy is as much about defining a coherent European industrial policy that drives innovation, that drives digital and eco-innovation and social innovation, at least as much as defending against unfair trade practices from the Chinese or from the US president. So I think the real game is about overcoming the internal divisions and overcoming the laziness, I might say, that we still see in some capitals. But when I look at major business organizations like BDI, the German Federation of Industry, they came up with a brilliant China strategy paper, which at the same time qualified as a strategy paper for European industrial policy. So I think there everything comes together.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Mr. Bütikofer. If I can paraphrase, what you're effectively saying is that, yes, we might be the nut, but the glass is actually half full, where there is already work being done. I'm just mixing my metaphors.
The nut is maybe also a nut of steel, maybe.
A nut of steel. Okay. Let's see how far we can take the analogy this afternoon. But turning over to you, Ms. Markussen, you look at Europe primarily through an economic and a financial economic lens. And I'd like to ask you specifically whether you think that Europe is up to this ambition that I think both Mr. de Hoop-Scheffer and Mr. Bütikofer share, of making Europe that more credible global actor. And in your view, what does that mean for the role of the euro? And can that be strengthened, or are we simply kidding ourselves? There's no... That's a shame. We're not hearing you. I don't know if there's anything we can do. Yes.
So it's still not working?
Yes. We're
It's
hearing
working?
now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. So basically, I think if we start off with something a little bit positive, it's interesting to notice that it was really only when the US went in on the Iranian deal that Europe woke up and realized how powerful a tool the US dollar is. The US dollar allows the US an amazing reach when it comes to implementing its geopolitical goals. And it was at that time that Europe woke up and for the first time stated an ambition to create an international role for the euro. So I would say that was actually quite positive. On the other hand, I also feel it's a little bit of a shame that we have to wait for something like that to happen for us to wake up in Europe. So it's sort of on the one hand good news, on the other hand it's bad news. But you start off by saying that my vantage point is economics, and that's very true. And what worries me as an economist looking at the world today is that we really came from a multilateral framework. And that multilateral framework was at many different levels. It concerns trade, concerns geopolitics, military. But I would also argue that the multilateral framework concerned something really important for us in the financial sector, and that was crisis management. If we look at how the previous financial crisis was managed, it was very much through cooperation and also in defining a future regulatory framework. And I think what we need to worry about today is if we go into a new crisis, will we be able to manage that in a collaborative approach? Or will it be a question of everyone trying to build the bed sheets towards themselves? And along similar lines, I would say that in the regulatory space, are we in danger today of moving towards more fragmentation, where each country or each zone is setting regulation to optimize its own agenda rather than cooperating? And my concern is that we are moving towards this more fragmented global order, and that in that context, Europe really has to move away from being what I think can be fairly termed a political adolescence, as we heard in the initial speech, to becoming an adult. So I've been trying to think about what does it mean to be an adult? It's not easy, but I think if you really want to be an adult, you have to have a clear vision about what you're doing. And I think this is the most important challenge for Europe today, to decide what is it that we want to be. There is an awful lot of ambiguity within Europe. We're not quite sure, do we want closer cooperation? Do we not want it? We're always sort of hesitating. We leave a lot of ambiguity, and I think we can no longer afford that. So I think we need to have the courage to build a new vision. I think we have every opportunity to do so. And just, to think about it, we're starting from a really strong point of fantastic assets. And I was looking, and I won't read them all to you, because I was just looking at the European institutions. We have an amazing set of institutions, with the Council, the Commission, the Parliament, the European Court of Justice, the Ombudsman. We have the ECB, the ECA, and I have a long list here. I won't read them all to you. But we have a very strong set of institutions. But I wonder, do our populations know these institutions? We also have very strong social and welfare models. Do we always appreciate them? And we have a wealth of experience to show us what works in these welfare models where we can really learn from each other. We heard this morning that Europe is a leader on climate change. We can use that to our advantage. And on top of that, something we haven't mentioned really directly, we did touch slightly upon it before lunch with the question of immigration, but Africa is on our doorstep and could be a fantastic opportunity for Europe. Should we really be letting the Chinese take over in Africa, or should we be stepping up to the plate and doing something? So I think we have tremendous opportunities that we can work on, but I think the way forward has to come from a vision. Because I have the pleasure to come to a lot of conferences. I haven't been to a single conference yet where someone said, no, let's walk away from it all and forget about it. But there's something missing in our ingredient, and to my mind, it's that vision that we can share with our populations and we can embrace it and move forward. And just as a concluding thought on this, you know, if you think about what is a populist is someone who's promising a romanticized return to the past, you know, probably a past that never existed. You know, what is it about take back control in Brexit? It's some kind of romanticized vision of taking back the UK maybe to the 1950s. How is that good? You know, at that time, 3% of the population had a refrigerator and there was food rationing. I don't think that was a very exciting time. You know, make America great again. It's again this romanticized vision of the past. But if you tell someone who's lost their job to a robot, and is now being competed in their new job in the service sector, maybe from an immigrant, that we're going to do more of the same, I'm going to say no, thank you. So to me, that's really what we miss today, is this idea of a strong vision for Europe.
Okay, thank you for that. I hesitate to give the floor back to Mr. Butikofer, who I'm sure, and I'm sure that the Greens have a particular vision that they are putting forward now that it's campaign season. But before I go back to the other panelists, I want to give Simon Hicks an opportunity to chip in and also Mr. De Hoop Scheffer to respond. Professor Hicks, you studied the European Parliament in depth. You have a deep understanding of the European institutions. We've heard the previous speakers lay out sort of an agenda of what we need, what Europe should be delivering for its citizens. Is that realistic, given what we are likely to see coming out of the European Parliament elections and the new Commission?
Thanks very much. As you say, I speak here today not really as a Brit. It's odd that I have to make that clear at international conferences I speak at now. I speak here as a scholar of the European institutions and a very passionate supporter of the process of European integration. And I'm very worried about where we are right now and where we're heading. I actually, following on from the previous speaker, I see two different visions emerging, and I think it's a little too simplistic to just describe the populist vision for Europe as just a harking back to the past. I think it's been evolving, and you can see, for example, the traditional vision for Europe is one of freedom and emancipation, both internally and externally. So internally, it's about removing barriers, opening up more opportunities for free movement of goods, services, capital and labour as a vehicle for generating growth and prosperity. Of course, with a safety net and minimum standards in environmental and social affairs and reinforcing existing welfare states. But also externally, a vision of freedom of global markets and free trade, and the EU being at the forefront of promoting globalization, the WTO and global markets, and really preferring to exercise a soft power globally rather than a hard power. So you can think of that as the traditional vision or the established vision of the process of European integration over the last 20 or 30 years. The populist vision is emerging as one around the theme of protection. A protectionist Europe. It's not in the sense the populists are not necessarily anti-Europeans anymore. They're pro-Europeans in a different sense. What they want is a Europe that is a protectionist Europe, both internally and externally, protecting Europe against a dangerous world. Closing Europe's borders to immigration, protectionist international trade policies, trying to exercise a hard power, potentially, particularly in our part of the world, but also protection internally, and here bringing back powers to nation states to protect themselves against the process of European integration internally, potentially unraveling what we've already built in the area in the Eurozone, and also unraveling what's been built around Schengen. So, in a sense, we're almost at the cusp of this point, and what I see coming in the European elections is really a battle between these two alternative visions of where Europe is heading. And if we read and look across at the current opinion polls, you can see a big shift, I think, in representation in the European Parliament for this more protectionist vision of Europe. more populist vision of Europe from the radical left and the populist right. We could have at least between 35 and 40% of the seats in the next European Parliament could come either from the radical left or the populist right. We're going to see a much smaller centrist pro-European bloc. For the first time, we'll see the EPP and the S&D, the grand coalition in the Parliament, fall below 50% of the seats. We'll see coalitions inside the European Parliament being much more difficult to build and maintain stable coalitions inside the European Parliament. So immediately we'll see that play out in terms of the formation of the next Commission. I think it's going to be quite difficult to get a Commission President of one of the two big party families through. There will have to be a package deal across all of the political institutions and presidential offices that are up for grabs. The difficulty, of course, is that will be seen as your classic centrist European cabal of the EPP, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and perhaps also the Greens. That's playing into the hands of those to say, see, we told you, they're just a self-interested, centrist, pro-European cabal, like ruling against the will of the people, which is questioning a lot of fundamental elements about this project. And then moving forward to think about the policy agenda of the EU going forward, I think we will see politicians and parties from some of these movements taking on some significant roles. They will be significantly represented in the European Council, with Polish Law and Justice, with Orban, who I expect to leave the EPP, of course with Lega and Five Star Movement in Italy. You can see representation at the highest level in the European Council, in the Council of Ministers, a big bloc in the European Parliament, perhaps getting some key committee positions and rapporteurships in the European Parliament. It's going to be a very new world in which to think about how to try and shape policy going forward in the EU.
Thank you for that. That's a somewhat sobering assessment. I'd now like to give Professor de Hoop-Scheffer the opportunity to pick up on some of the points that you've heard raised in response to your keynote address, and perhaps push you a little bit and ask what would be sort of the key 2-3 things that the new Commission should really take on board, despite some of the difficulties that Professor Hicks mentioned. I mean, let's assume that there will be a next Commission. What should be the 2-3 priorities that they should really sink their teeth into?
I think in answering your question, I would not start with the Commission first of all, because I think the burden of responsibility now really is and should be with the heads of states and government. They have decided already a number of years ago, we are the crisis mechanism, we are the ones who are calling the shots, and this is not a plea against the Commission at all. They have to take Europe in their own hands, and as Professor Hicks was rightly saying, that will become more difficult. Why is it becoming more difficult? The European political middle ground has itself to blame, because you see in many countries, including this country, the Netherlands, the traditional parties who all stem from a pro-European tradition have thought, well, if we put a few populist feathers in our cap or on our cap, we might attract more voters. And they have not been honest to their roots, not been honest with themselves. So, I mean, the European political middle, and I define that middle quite widely, has itself to blame. So I do think, and there is a declaration from Sibiu in Romania, which is fine, which is nice, but these are up till now words. And when I say the European Council, as I said in my brief introduction, I really think that France and Germany, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, and who knows, a new Chancellor, if that's Madame Kramp-Karrenbauer or any other, it is up to the Germans, up to the CDU-CSU to decide, that they get their act together. Because you can speak about Hanseatic coalitions here in the Netherlands, you can try to form different alliances. When there is a different narrative from Berlin and from Paris, it will not work. It will not work internally, as Professor Hicks was analyzing the top jobs. It also will not work externally. And a European Union which I want, and which I want to survive geopolitically, vis-à-vis the Chinese and the United States of America and an assertive Russia. I noted, by the way, in preparing this little talk, that I could not have imagined, I think 6 or 7 years ago, that It would be an introduction of almost equidistance between China and the United States. All right, we still have NATO, we still have solidarity, we still have Article 5, but I could not have imagined myself giving such an introduction in before Trumpian times, and let's hope that Trumpian times are ending earlier than one might expect, but I'm not so certain. So my answering your question, Rem Korteweg, is the narrative in Berlin and the narrative in Paris. Macron, and then I ended not for nothing with Tip O'Neill and all politics is local. Macron had wide-ranging ideas, but he also had the Gilets jaunes, his yellow vest, which all politics is local, which limits the ability. He can put the European Union en marche, to use his expression. And I must say, as I said politely in my speech, I see a certain, how shall I phrase this, a certain paralysis in Berlin, in Germany, I don't like, because I think that Germany should and must be at the forefront, not only in the realm of defense, but in the realm of ideas about the future of the European Union. But again, I end where I started. Nothing much will happen, be it internally or externally, if we do not hear the same narrative from Paris and from Berlin.
And by coincidence, we have a German and a French participant. So we're going to continue this unpacking the Franco-German motor, if you will. Mr. Bütikofer, you are a member of the European Parliament, but you also carry a German passport. Could you comment on not just what Mr. de Hoop Scheffer said, this appeal for German leadership, but also perhaps addressing Ms. Markeson's point about this necessity of a vision? And I already kind of hinted at that. I'm sure that you, as a Green Party member, will certainly have a vision for Europe. And also, if I can pile on, Mr. Hicks's analysis that it's going to get more difficult in the European Parliament. So I think we should listen to you for a minute and get your insights on where things stand with respect to Germany, but also with respect to the European Parliament. Please.
Thank you. Campaigning as I am at the moment, I do not allow myself the luxury of pessimism. And even if I was a pessimist of reason, I would still insist on being an optimist of will. And I am a bit disappointed by what Professor Hicks said, painting in the darkest of colors what's coming up. There will be a major change, a monumental change in the European Parliament, that's for sure. But I would not describe that as a dissolution of the center, rather as a reconfiguration of the center. The two former mainstay parties, EPP and SND, will get weaker, but Liberals and Greens will get stronger. And I am completely convinced that we do own the capabilities and the insights that will allow us to chart a course forward. My vision is threefold, I might say. One is built on the famous Kantian vision of perennial peace, where he describes globalization of democracy and globalization of exchange, cultural and economic exchange, as the two pillars of a global order of peace. I share that vision. And that's why I'm supporting the concept of multilateralism. I just read an article by Professor Mearsheimer, who argues that the liberal international order was bound to fail. I don't agree at all. And I also, sorry, Secretary General, I don't agree with your statement of equidistance. I don't feel that way with regard to the Chinese or the Americans. I think we still share a lot more, notwithstanding that we don't like the president in the White House. So I believe that the second element of the vision is the necessity to transform our economies and our societies to live within the borders of global sustainability. And the third vision is indeed, Professor Hicks, about protection. I refuse to accept the equation that protecting is the same as protectionism. When we protect European industry against unfair competition, that is not protectionism, that's just creating a level playing field. When we insist on protecting people, protecting small businesses, protecting people that are jobless, unemployed, against an unfair development of globalization, I don't think that this is something that we should reject as a negative notion. I agree with President Macron when he says that, yes, Europe should be a factor of protection. And I do think that the nationalists and the authoritarians that you spoke about are trying to shape their concepts of protecting in the framework of nationalism. And that's a major difference to them. We think that there's only a way to establish European sovereignty on the big issues. And we cannot dream of recreating national sovereignties on issues like climate change or international peace. So they try to transform the EU and to make it into a club of nationalists. But that's their weakness also, because they are not understanding the lesson that Paul-Henri Spaak told us many years ago when he said there are only two kinds of countries in Europe, the small countries and the countries that do not yet know they're small. Now we're learning all of us are small, but together we're really capable to be very powerful, and we see that in the trade sector, and we can also do that in other sectors. I do believe that we can also grow up with regards to security. So protecting is an element of the vision. It's not the only part, but it should be integrated.
Can I just follow up and ask you, Mr. Bütikofer, regarding Germany's position in this new institutional cycle? Can we expect a more sort of proactive Germany on these more geopolitical topics? Is politics in Berlin able to deliver on that demand that we see not just here in the Netherlands as expressed by Mr. de Hoop-Scheffer, but you saw it in various formats in various countries over the past couple of months, this appeal for Germany to play that stronger role in terms of making Europe more coherent and credible?
I agree with that. I do believe there cannot be any type of European Weltpolitikfähigkeit, as Jean-Claude Juncker said, no European capability of being a global political player without Germany understanding that it has to contribute to that effort. Presently, German politics has grown stale. And I really believe that there has to be a new opening, a new impetus, a new start, a fresh start. I don't see a major new departure being delivered by the present German government. So they're just waiting for their opportunity to run from the coalition that they feel themselves forced to stick with, even though either side hates the other. I believe that Germany, in order to play a new role, just like France with President Macron, has to also find the courage to come up with a new internal combination of forces. Otherwise, we tend to be a blocking factor, I'm afraid.
And the Greens, I might add, might play an important role in this, given where public opinion seems to be pointing towards. Can I now turn to Ms. Markussen? you're based in Paris. Could you reflect a little bit on the role that Macron and France are playing in this new Europe, and perhaps also connect to it what from, again, coming back to your predominantly economic vantage point, whether France is an inhibitor or a problem in delivering that, a facilitator or an inhibitor in delivering that economic promise that you described?
So I think when we look at the Macron presidency, it's clear that one of the very strong characteristics of Macron is he's extremely convinced about the value of the European model. We saw the Sorbonne speech where he set out a very ambitious view for Europe, covering many different areas, and interestingly covering many of the areas that we've been discussing here today, ranging both from the economic topics to the geopolitical to the military topics. So it's clear that the current government in France has a very strong view about what Europe should be. And I think if we look at the European agenda today, I don't think it's really very easy to say that there's one country or one element that's to blame. I would say if we're looking at Europe today, I really think it's, I like this idea of us being a political adolescent, because if we look throughout the process, there are just many areas where we struggle to move ahead. And I would say one of the areas that we have lost a little bit of is trust amongst the member states. You know, when I think about the international role of the euro, and we heard it mentioned many times this morning, I think a safe European asset is a key building block. Being able to have a well-functioning banking union, a true capital markets union. But all of those elements depend on handing over some form of sovereignty. They depend on some level of risk sharing, some level of risk reduction as well. And I think it's about rebuilding that trust between the member states that's absolutely critical. Now, if we think about trust, that can take an awful long time to rebuild. So I think what we have to do is, rather than hoping we can rebuild it, is to have the courage to trust each other and to move ahead very, very quickly. My concern as an economist is that over the coming years we will face another economic downturn, and I don't think we should expect the US nor China to be in the mood to address this in a multilateral framework, and as such it really will be up to Europe to have the strength. So from the perspective of France today, and France is my adopted country, as anyone in this room who's heard me speak French will know very clearly. You can see my name is quite Nordic in its nature, but I strongly believe in the European model. I strongly believe in what Europe can deliver. I think that there is a shared view in Europe that we need a stronger Europe, and I think what we need to do is be able to compromise and build up. What I would say, though, is I disagree a little bit on the idea that it's only about Paris and Berlin. I think it was true at a time that Paris and Berlin reflected the different views in Europe quite well. I'm not 100% convinced that this is the case today, and I would think that including Rome is very important as well, but also giving consideration to the other European capitals in building this vision. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah, just in support of Mr. de Hoop-Scheffer's comments, I think what he meant is that the Franco-German tandem is necessary but not sufficient. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I think it's a precondition. We need, and I mentioned the Hanseatic coalition. I mean, the Dutch government, for those who don't realize, is also operating within the Hanseatic format, which is a format with a few Nordic countries and Baltic countries. Fine. I mean, you can build any coalition you want. But I think, Rem Korteweg, I'll stick to my point that more than ever now our British friends are what I called nearing the end of the debate on their voluntary political suicide. Europe becoming more continental. It is essential that France and Germany agree on the way forward. So we need French-German leadership. I mean, I can't say it more clearly. And of course, other capitals are important. certainly in the framework of capitals as was mentioned, Orban in Hungary and the Italian coalition. I mean, we have a very complicated political picture, but bringing the European Union as this unique project we all need forward. That is why I spoke about China and the US. Indeed, of course, not because we have as much with China and with the US. We share the values with the US very much, although it's from time to time different in these Trumpian times. I add once again, but I stick to my point that I think the narratives from France and Germany. To give you one brief example, the Sorbonne speech by Emmanuel Macron was mentioned. The reaction from Germany came, and the German ambassador will correct me when I'm wrong now or later, came from Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and not from the Chancellor. Now, I can understand. But if you compare those two speeches, you see two different narratives. And that's what's worrying me.
I want to go to Professor Hicks and ask you, as a professor of political science, could you shed your light on this tension, in a way, that the member states may be more important, whereas in terms of decision-making power, the European Parliament and the institutions are still very, very crucial. And could you just address this topic of Franco-German cooperation in a context of the two visions you described? And as a Brit, can I ask you to address the Brexit question, because it has popped up not just once but twice. What role should we expect from the UK in the next institutional cycle?
How long have you got? Let me first say, on the first point there, my understanding of the history of European integration is at key points in the process. There's a new package deal that gets put together. If we go back to the 50s and 60s, you can think about the package that allowed the creation of the common market. And then if you think about the 1980s, you can think about the package that allowed the creation of the single market alongside the structural funds, minimum social and environment standards. And I don't see the emergence of a new grand bargain that would allow a major step forward that is necessary in the things that Michele was talking about here, in capital union, banking union, deeper economic and monetary union, plus also a new major step forward in defence and security. I mean, everybody amongst ourselves, we can all agree this is what Europe needs, both for its security, its global projection of power, its economic efficiency internally. But I don't see the elements of the grand bargain that would allow 27 member states to actually come on board now in such a heterogeneous, such a pluralist polity that we now have. Far more heterogeneous than in the 50s, far more heterogeneous than in the 80s and 90s. And when I say heterogeneous, I mean heterogeneous in terms of policy preferences or policy positions over economics, security, global questions. This is the concern that I have. In terms of how Britain fits into this, I think right now in the UK, there's an obsession with what's going to happen in the next few days, the next few weeks, the next few months. Whereas, and I don't see, and I find frustrating, a vision of a relationship between the UK and the EU for 5 to 10 years from now. And my vision that I would like to see is the UK and the EU as very close partners. And I often use the analogy of Canada and the United States. Of course, the balance is slightly different between Canada and the United States and the UK and the EU, but the spirit of it should be the same. Very closely integrated markets, global security partners in whether it's in climate change, in global trade, in fighting terrorism, in data sharing, in defence cooperation. I mean, I think the Britain will go through the pain of leaving the EU, but we will immediately start to rebuild a lot of the connections we had, because the whole reason, the economic, the political and the security reasons why we were in the EU in the first place are not going to go away. They are still there. And so there will be new rebuilding of closer economic, closer social relations. And here I speak as a professor in a university, but equally close defence relations. And I can imagine an annual EU-UK security summit, for example. So I would like both from the EU side and the UK side to set out a positive version of a vision of a partnership between the EU27 and the UK 5 to 10 years from now, and I don't see that emerging.
Thank you very much. And with that, our time has run out, unfortunately. So I am just going to take a minute or two to thank you, all four of you, for sharing your insights with us. Over the past hour, we've moved from the geopolitical framework and the challenges that Europe faces being squeezed in the proverbial nutcracker between China and America to a discussion on the necessity for Europe to get its act together, to the challenges in a new European Parliament where it will be more difficult to find working majorities, where there are tensions and difficulties in terms of how to get the member states up and running, the crucial role that a Franco-German cooperation plays, and with some Brexit sprinkled on top. And with that, again, I want to thank our four speakers. I want to very much thank the organizers for making it possible to have debates like this about the future of Europe, covering areas from financial economic issues all the way up to grand strategy and geopolitics. And as a think tanker, I am comforted by the thought that also private sector players, such as banks, are willing to play that role in making debates like this possible. And with that, I think this wraps up the European element of our program, and everyone will continue the discussions inside their national capitals or national sort of formats. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ram, thank you very much. Please stay seated. That was...
Je sais pas trop. Hello, Stefan. Do you hear me? No, he doesn't hear me. Stefan? Frau Schubert, können Sie London Bescheid sagen? Haben Sie schon? Hey, zeigen Sie mal ein Bild in London. Hey, Stefan? Ja, ich kann Ihnen ja hier vor Ort sagen, worauf wir warten. Wir warten auf einen Oettinger. Und deswegen wollte ich das dem Stefan schon mal sagen. Aber er scheint uns nicht zu hören. Irgendwie sind die Mikrofone ausgefallen. Hey, Stefan. Stefan.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, Stefan, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. We wait maybe another 3-4 minutes because we wanted to start with the keynote of Commissar Oettinger, but if he's not here, then we start our discussion, okay?
Okay, fine. So he hasn't arrived yet?
He hasn't arrived yet, but maybe we have the board member of Pulse of Europe. Why don't you start to talk with him? Stefan.
Sorry, I didn't get what you said.
Okay, so please listen. Why don't we start and talk to the CEO of Pulse of Europe? And
where is he?
he's sitting here in front of us.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, so that's why. Okay, great. Yes, let's do that.
Why don't you start and then we wait for Oettinger, because they have planned a lot, and you ask him what they have planned, that everybody goes and vote for Europe. Okay?
Yes, wonderful.
Also unser Moderator, why don't you start? Why don't you tell us what have you planned in the next few days?
Thanks, Mr. Maleki. I don't know whether I can be heard in London.
Yes, they hear you.
You hear me? but we can't hear you.
You can't hear us?
Now the mic is good.
Yes.
Können wir ihn bitte zeigen, ja?
Okay, well then I'll pick up the question that you've asked. I mean, we are a civilian movement, and we have started off 2.5 years ago to promote the European idea and to stand up for its core values. This is basically what we do, and of course the European parliamentary elections are crucial for each of us, as we've heard this morning. And we have launched a campaign in order to really ask the people in the middle ground to go to the polls and really vote. And we have a set of formats, being it rallies in the streets, being it things like European Poetry Slam, etc., pp., to reach out to different people in different social settings, and to really make them aware of the necessity to go to the polls this time. And well, in the coming days, there are a lot of things going on. Yesterday we had an interesting program at the Goethe University. We will have one of our rallies next Sunday in Frankfurt and many other cities across Europe. And we will, I think, close up the whole campaign in Frankfurt on the 23rd. I don't know whether you have heard, Mr. Becker. We are going to do something in connection with the Paulskirche. And we, so to speak, want to set the last big positive sign and make the Paulskirche completely European. So this will be a light show together with a program, with music, with a European feeling, and I think this will set the scene for the 3 days of elections in Europe. And I hope that not only the intellectual piece that we've heard before, but also the emotional side, the pictures, the symbols, the European symbols, can do its or their share.
You know, actually, here in London we have had the greatest demonstration, I think, ever, just a few weeks ago, which was for Remain and against Brexit. So I guess in some ways you may say that Frankfurt and London are the leaders in the popular movement in favor of Europe. Would you agree with that?
I don't want to exclude other cities, of course, but I've seen, of course, the demonstration. It was very impressive, seeing so many people in the street standing up for their ideas and values. And of course, we are doing the same. And, you know, Frankfurt, as Mr. Becker will maybe continue to promote his city later on, is a very open and liberal city. And there are many people around who are open to others, who feel the European idea, who actually live the European idea. And therefore, I think, yes, Frankfurt is a good place to promote the European idea and to set a firm and strong sign and continue to do so.
But can you explain to us a little bit? You started, or you have promoted this movement of citizens for Europe, and from where do these people come? Are they young, old, from all corners, or are they specific to certain groups in the society?
Well, it's not easy to characterize such a civilian movement, particularly because it's a very fluid thing. People come and go, city groups grow or shrink, but generally speaking, I would say that there are more academics than non-academics. People, politically, I would say they are in the middle ground, but a wide range from the left middle to the right middle, conservative part, Greens, etc. Most of them are not members of a party. Some of them are, but they leave that aside because we are a non-partisan organization, so not attached to a party, but very open. And in terms of age, yeah, we have a lot of young activists in student cities like Heidelberg or Regensburg, for example. Our teams are organized by students, basically. And in other cities, we have people between, I would say, 30 and in their late 70s. So in this regard, it's a wide range.
And what is their desire? What is the vision that animates these people?
Well, first of all, I think we share the analysis that our European Union is under pressure and under threat. And we started off after the Brexit referendum and the Trump election because for us the two events were game changers in a way. And we realized that from now on, things that we had taken for granted are no longer for granted, and we have to do something because we think that the civil society has to play a strong role. If we don't do so and we leave the playground to the nationalists, then we have lost already. Democracy can only be kept up if the Democrats are really standing up, fighting for it day by day. And the vision, we don't have a political, we haven't formulated a political idea of how Europe should be shaped, but rather we wanted to start off by sharing the idea that we have to show solidarity, that we have to set a scene for an emotion, a European emotion, that we start creating or helping to create a real European civil society, which only exists in parts of the society, in a very mobile part of the society. And that's one. And the other part is we wanted to create a platform where discussion can take place in an open space.
Okay, Stefan, Commissioner Oettinger has arrived. I hand over to him, and he is now to have his keynote. Commissioner Oettinger, it's your time. Thank you. Please welcome him with me.
Dear host and moderator, Mr. Maleki, dear panelists, dear colleagues from London, ladies and gentlemen. What is our situation in spring 2019? Germany, our EU, how do we see our actual state of play? Looking back, last 6 years have been really good years, seeing our European economies, our European labor markets. Year by year, our economic growth was higher than expected before. Labor markets are in a better situation than in 2013, 14 or 15. Even our budgetary structure in nearly all member states is quite stable, is good. Now, the spring forecast is analyzing 2019, 2020, and our economic growth is decreasing. Take our 3 Eurozone locomotives, France, Italy, Germany. France economic growth is about 1%, Italy 0.1%, and Germany 0.5%. If you compare these 3 European big member states, and if you see other ripe countries globally, Canada, or Korea, or Switzerland, or the US, all of them have a growth in 2019 between 2 and 3%. And in parallel, we have to see we are living in a competition of order of values, more than ever. You can say a battle of the systems. Here, our order of value, our European order of value, our German order of value, our British order of value, democracy and a parliament. Social market economy, rule of law, freedom of belief, of religion, of press, and these values are under pressure. Because globally, more and more competitors don't accept or don't trust or don't realize these values. Autocrats in Ankara, autocrats in Moscow, some autocrats tweeting day by day from the White House. And the completely different system is China. And China has a clear vision via Made in China 2025, being in 2049 number one for technologies, for industries, and for military as well. Do we have a vision in our EU, in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in London? No, we don't have. And if we want to stabilize our order of values, if we are convinced that parliamentarian democracy, that social market economy, that rule of law, that our liberal society, full of freedom and rights, that freedom of speech, of belief, of religion, should be stabilized for us and our kids, then we have to fight, therefore. At the moment, we don't fight for our order of values. It's not clear which governance will survive. Is it the Chinese governance, the European way, or is it the US? We are in a kind of a sandwich position. And so we need, I think, a stronger European Union. It has to do about world politics ability. World politics ability. We have to speak about an European Union speaking with one voice, having one common and coherent position, seeing Venezuela, seeing Istanbul, seeing Syria, seeing sanctions and Russia, seeing competitiveness and the digital revolution, or Made in China 2025. So we need more Europe. Our EU, we have two groups of countries. First group, countries, member states being small. The second group, member states, and they know that they are small. No member state is big. Even not France, not the United Kingdom, not Germany. Germany, in a few years, we have 1% of the global citizens. 1%. It's nothing. If we want to play a role designing the world of 2050, fighting against climate change, defining standards for our industries, being an technological pioneer, stabilizing our own sovereignty, then we have to work together in a better manner as we are doing today. Now our friends in the United Kingdom are willing or are trying to leave the EU. They don't find the way out for the moment. Our position is an exit without any regulation would be worst case. We have to avoid an exit without any regulation. So extension and flexibility is our position as a European Commission, as a Council, as a European Parliament. Because an exit without any regulation would be terrible for the UK economy and difficult for our EU 27 economies, for our citizens as well. Yesterday, the government in London announced UK is taking part when we have end of May an European election and afterwards a new European Parliament. My friend, member of the Commission, Julian King, coming from UK, is my best advisor. His outlook is the following. 1/3 of all votes are for Labour and for the Conservatives, but together 1/3. 20% for Labour, 14 for the Conservative. 14, not 40, 14. A second third, 1/3 for Farage and his new group, a Brexit party, and for UKIP, 1/3. But 1/3 for Remainers, for Liberals, Greens, New People, saying UK should stay in our EU. Interesting. And my dream is maybe there's a second referendum or an earlier election or anything else to avoid that the exit is coming before end of this year. Because, let me say in an informal manner, Great Britain will be Little England afterwards. Sorry. And we need a stronger Europe, EU plus. And my hope is that we have some new discussions in London and the exit is not a reality next weeks. It's about our European competitiveness. If you see the digital revolution with big data, with artificial intelligence, Europe and Germany, we are lagging behind. We have some strong positions, seeing robotic, sensoric, photonics, but seeing platforms, seeing big data strategies, seeing artificial intelligence and industries, we are totally lagging behind. Not all policies have to be Europeanized, but we need a European digital policy and strategy. We have to come to a digital union, digital single market. And research and innovation has to be a European dimension. No company, not Siemens, not Philips, not Schneider Electric, not Bosch, standalone, has the human resources, the number of IT specialists, engineers, and the money to compete with Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon, and on the other hand, Tencent, Huawei, and Alibaba. No member state has a financial power. Not France, not Italy, not UK, not Germany. But together, as a joint undertaking, a public-private partnership, European Union and Horizon Europe and Digital Europe, our European financial programs, plus several member states, plus our industries, together as a public-private team, we can compete. We can hold our position when we are a frontrunner, robotic. And we can come to a competitive situation where we are lagging behind artificial intelligence. So we need a stronger Europe. It's about sovereignty, it's about world politics ability, it's about competitiveness. What is the main challenge after your European election in June and July? Never before we had such a development that nobody from our first row will continue to be a senior manager, a president in our EU. President Tusk will finish his career end of November as a president of the European Council. My President Juncker will finish his career end of October or before end of the year. 28, 27 commissioners, at max 4 are coming back to a next mandate. Who is following President Tajani, President of the European Parliament? Who is following Madame Mogherini, responsible for foreign affairs? She would like to come back, but Salvini and Di Maio are never willing to propose her as an Italian commissioner. Who's following Draghi, ECB, here in Frankfurt? Who's following Minister Centeno? Maybe he will finish his career in the Portuguese government, and so he can not continue as the president of the Euro group. And these 5, 6 very, very important posts and functions. Therefore, we need a balanced package. Western Europe and Eastern Europe, North, South, women and men, Christian Democrats, Conservatives, plus Socialists, plus Liberals, plus Macronists. And to organize this balanced package is the main challenge to see before end of the year. Is Europe stabilized? Is it about good governance? Do we have a coherent team? Or are we failing? And I think this should be interesting for all of you, because it's your European Commission, your European Council, your European Parliament, your ECB, your Eurozone group. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation, Commissioner. I think it was a very frank description of the challenges that we are faced at the moment. And it certainly makes clear how important it is to go and vote and elect the European Parliament that is up to the level of these challenges. I would like to say also that maybe this particular meeting we have now here between Frankfurt and London is actually well chosen, because I think both cities in both countries are actually hubs of liberal, open attitudes towards the world, and we have a similar enjoyment of the liberal qualities of life. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And in this context, maybe I could ask first the mayor of the city of Frankfurt, Mr. Becker, to give us his impressions and also maybe the questions you would like to address to an audience here in London.
Well, let me first say that I'm sure that for, I would say, all of us, the day of the referendum was like waking up with a nightmare. When I went to bed, I was thinking that on the next morning we will see polls results, probably like 30% that would like to be out, and the big majority would like to stay in. And the result was as what we have to deal with today. And I think what the Pulse of Europe was also already addressing is that we can't take things for granted that we kind of thought that we just could give from one generation to the other. It's nothing that comes for granted, but that every generation has to work for. And even with all the possible aspects, the possible chances, the possibilities for Frankfurt as the major financial center on the continent, I'm too much a European that I would not underline the wish that Mr. Oettinger was just addressing, to say that I would really hope that the Brits will find an exit from Brexit. And of course, what you are saying about the two cities, when we see the results even of the referendum in London and on the countryside, you see a lot of what was just said in a few words, what is the view of people in an urban structure, which doesn't mean just urban in the sense of a single city society, but of a society that knows and learns that we are connected. We're connected culturally, we are connected in the way we deal with the world, we're connected in the way we are trading, our commerce is going. And of course, Frankfurt is the most international city in Germany. No, people would say perhaps Berlin. I always say Berlin is international by office. We are international by our DNA. Because even back in medieval times, trade was done here as the center in the Holy Roman Empire, the electoral and the crowning city. All the European path routes went through Frankfurt. And like the airport today, if you want or not, you are passing Frankfurt. And of course, more and more people are getting to Frankfurt. And if you look at the economic side, the European Central Bank, we have EIOPA, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority. We have the European Systemic Risk Boards, the Single Supervisory mechanism. So all this structure, all the institutions of the supervisory, of the regulatory side, of the monetary policy, is here made in Frankfurt. And of course, for that reason, Frankfurt is one of the European cities, well, not the European city, also in Germany. And we live from connecting. And when the decision was made in London, or the Brexit was decided in Great Britain, it was also here that we said that we do not go to London like birds that are sticking for the nice parts that we gain, but to begin a partnership. We really stood there and said, and you got people in London today, we're of course in a way of competition, but at the same time we are not going to dig for the treasures, but we wanted to create a new partnership because we are so much knowing that Europe stands and falls with this and the upcoming generations and the chances and the risks within. And for that reason, I would really like to address from here the first wish that Great Britain finds a way and not at the far end come from commonwealths to chaos. Mr. Oettinger very well said about the small England. It's not my perspective wanting Great Britain to lose its role, and of course London will not lose totally its role as a financial center. But the chances are more in the cooperation, and that is what I would like to address here towards London, that Frankfurt, first hoping that you're staying in, but on the next step, if not, then we are going to create a partnership for the benefit of both financial and not only financial centers, but for the cultural centers that we create and we're standing for.
Well, thank you very much for these words, but I tell you, as important and as, I guess, understandable as it is that many Europeans on the continent would like to keep Britain within the Union, the debates here are so heated that you're burning your fingers as soon as you say something about this. And so it's an interesting experience for us in London to hear what the attitudes about this are on the continent. Mr. Jeffcoat, you have kind of a unique perspective because you are a Brit, but you live in Frankfurt, and you have the best of all worlds, I guess.
I think that's a very good description. Thank you very much for that. Yes, I'm a Brit. I was born in the Midlands of England many, many years ago, but for the past 27 years I've been living in Frankfurt. I came to Frankfurt in 1992 after 10 years in Japan and a few months in between in London, and my friends in Tokyo and London said, "You must be mad, why are you going to Frankfurt?" And my wife and I married 2 years later, and her friends in Vienna thought that she was even madder. Why would you leave Vienna to go to Frankfurt? And in the first couple of years, I think that my impression of Frankfurt was that it was a rather soulless place. But in the meantime, I discovered that it's certainly not soulless. So my understanding, or my family's understanding of the place and our feeling well in the place has progressed. But in addition to that, I've got the feeling that, or the strong impression that Frankfurt has made some very positive developments in the last 10 years in particular, looking across the whole range of industrial business activity, but also cultural activity in terms of the educational sector. Frankfurt is on the up, and it's a great place to live. And in the meantime, I have got the best of both worlds in the sense that I have two passports. I am a Brit and a German in the meantime.
Very good. I think many Brits living on the continent have taken this kind of insurance policy out, and probably some others, I know of them here in London, have done the same. Mr. Menges, you are in charge of, if I may put it bluntly, promoting the whole area in and around Frankfurt. And we heard one thing before, which is talking about London. I mean, London in many ways is a much bigger area in terms of population and all that. But we've heard how important it is to integrate the city and the not rural areas around, but those that are less urban than that. How is Frankfurt dealt with this particular issue of integrating the surroundings with the city?
Well, thank you, and certainly hello to our friends back in Frankfurt, particular the mayor of Frankfurt and Frank Scheidig sitting on the left. I like your socks, by the way. But you're talking about the regional integration. That has been not an easy process, and in some instances, actually, I've been reminded in many instances of the European process, because you know, when we talk about the region of Frankfurt, the greater Frankfurt Rhine-Main region, sometimes you travel 5 to 10 minutes by car and you find yourself in a different municipality with the different administration in charge, with the different mayor. And in 2005, we had to bring all these different municipalities, all these counties, and the state of Hessen together under one roof, which is now called the Frankfurt Rhine-Main GmbH, which is the organization that I have the pleasure to run. And at first, there was a lot of, you know, what's in it for us? What are we going to gain? It was really only about, you know, each individual. There was a time when, you know, even some of the organizations that joined at first decided to leave again. So, you know, it reminds us of something. In the meantime, we've proven that, you know, by an adjustment of the strategy, we can bring benefit to all the areas around Frankfurt, and by delivering real results. And that has created an attraction factor, a pull factor, where we're now seeing that, we're reaching across state borders into the neighboring states, Rhineland-Palatinate, more known around the city of Mainz, northern Bavaria. They have joined our organization, the Frankfurt Rhine-Main region, in order to promote the region as one body, as one economic area. And that has proven to be increasingly successful, and we still have those discussions. What's in it for us? But less and less so. So I think that has been quite an integral part of building the brand, but also building the success of Frankfurt and the greater region.
So basically, what you say, Britain in, Britain out. One has to emphasize the synergies and the potential gains that cooperation can always produce, which, of course, is a very European message. I would like to bring the economy a little bit more into this discussion, and in particular, there is a big question as to whether Brexit is a great bonanza perspective for Frankfurt as a financial center. Mr. Markovic works for the EBRD, which is a European bank here in London, but it's not a European Union institution. And as such, they will not move. They will stay here. But they are very active, especially in the whole transformation economy areas in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, but all the way to even Morocco. And I would like to ask you, Mr. Markovic, what do you expect will happen in terms of, let's say, if we project the next 10 years in terms of financial markets, banking structures, the opportunities for cities like Frankfurt, but maybe also others like Paris and Amsterdam and even Ireland. How do you see this evolve, and will it be the end of London?
So, thank you very much, Professor Collignon. As you mentioned, the EBRD is owned by around 70 different countries globally. So, when it comes to the impact of Brexit, given the global ownership, it will not affect our capital, and we will indeed stay in London. But we expect first some moderate impact on our countries of operation, particularly in Eastern Europe, through several channels. The first one is that Brexit is expected to result in around 10 to 15% reduction in structural and accession funds available to this part of the world, which translated into a share of EU-supported investment is around 0.4 percentage points. So small, but not negligible, given that the major investor in this region is the European Union. The second is the trade, and not only the part of the trade which is a direct export from the Eastern European countries to the UK, but also a part of the trade given that many of the Eastern European countries are part of the value chain of companies in Germany, for example, that then export to the UK. So we estimate this total share of trade that might be impacted at around 7% of the Eastern European export. Of course, I'm not saying that Brexit will impact all these 7%. The harder the Brexit and the more friction it creates in the EU exports to the UK due to the customs borders and so on, if it happens, the closer to the 7% we'll have. But perhaps most challenging, the impact of Brexit, and particularly on the non-EU Eastern European countries, may come if the EU focus on enlargement and thus support for the reforms in this region, not only non-EU countries, but maybe Eastern European countries within the European Union, if it weakens, if all things that happen with Brexit refocus to other topics and we don't pay attention to this region. If this focus on enlargement weakens, that can also open the door for competing geopolitical influences, notably China and Russia, which may have, shall I say, a different reform agenda. So while we consider the impact on Eastern Europe of Brexit to be very moderate economically, we continue to watch the space for this longer-term reform impact that might happen. In the longer run, and coming to your question about opportunities in financial market, I'd say, like the Commissioner Oettinger mentioned, that a major challenge for Eastern Europe will be financing innovation. If you're thinking about the economic growth model in Eastern Europe, population there is not rising. So the growth will have to come from productivity and will likely have to come from innovation. But there's a big challenge. Financial systems in Eastern Europe, as well as in Western Europe, are very much bank-centric. And banks are not very good in lending for innovation. Banks in Eastern Europe lend against collateral and history. And innovative firms are either young, without history and collateral, or even if they're more mature, investment innovation is intangible, therefore not easy to collateralize. So the question is, how do we really fund this new model? And that's, if you take a look what's happening now with non-bank finance, finance such as venture capital, private equity, crowdfunding, or capital markets in general, London, the UK and London, is much ahead of the rest of the Europe. But it's still not at a sufficient level. So I'd say that a future growth model in both Eastern and Western Europe based on financing innovation is giving quite a lot of space for financial development in both Frankfurt and London. And if Brexit happens, particularly in Frankfurt, making sure that access to non-bank funding for innovation purposes remains as ample or actually increases is one of the major goals. So speaking about that, alternatively, of course, identifying ways for banks to engage more in funding innovation, certainly not in early stage, but maybe in the growth stage of firms, or through non-collateralized lending, maybe a Europe-specific way to boost innovation in both Eastern and Western Europe. So this part of business is an opportunity for both cities.
Well, that's very interesting, and I think we really should focus on the innovation issue, although that in itself needs an enormous amount of human capital built up, which probably is not so present in many of these countries you were talking about. So that in itself poses the question how much capacity is in there. But I would like to add to that one thing regarding the speech by Commissioner Oettinger. He was mentioning, asking the question about which model will prevail, China or the West, or something like that. This is a question that we used to ask during the Cold War. I don't have any doubt about this nowadays, that there's only, especially as you rightly point out, with stagnating population, growth comes from innovation. And innovation comes from intellectual flexibility, openness. I do not think that the Chinese model of government control and controlling the minds in many ways will offer those kind of opportunities. China is doing well by copying what has been invented in very innovative and intellectually flexible countries. But with that is the question also, this human capital that creates innovation and financing that kind of innovation. Is Frankfurt capable of providing that? Professor Winkler, you have looked at these kind of infrastructure and network aspects in the financial area. Do you think that Frankfurt could actually catch the ball and take up this kind of these opportunities that Mr. Markovic has mentioned, or do you think it is rather a competitive advantage that London will maintain come what may?
Well, it's a bit difficult after all these big debates which we had definitely in the second or third panel to talk about now financial centers, but I don't think that is an issue that Frankfurt can. The question is, will Frankfurt do that? And that is a different question. I think Frankfurt can and could. The question, will it move? And here the economic history and theory suggests that movements of financial centers as a whole from one city to the other city have not been observed, and actually for good reason. The first reason is that there are strong network effects which are characterizing financial centers. So they are there because people meet there and people go there in order to meet, which is reinforcing each other. So it would need a really big shock that something major happens with regard to the localization and the size of financial centers. Actually, when I was listening today to some of the presentation, there was the mentioning of the international role of the euro. I recall 20 years ago when the euro was created, many people thought that the euro would now become an international currency, which it actually became, but it would actually also be in a position to threaten the dominant role of the dollar. And we have seen that this has not been taking place. This doesn't mean that the euro is not an international currency, but it shows that political events like the creation of the euro as such are not enough to change the key parameters of the global financial system. I also don't expect for this to happen with regard to financial centers. So to answer your question, I think Frankfurt can, but I don't think that it will in the sense of taking major pieces away from London. The evidence which we have so far support this also. What we see is, there has been now just a project done by two colleagues from the University of Heidelberg, that we see, yes, we see some relocations in certain parts, for example, in banking coming to Frankfurt, in asset management going to Dublin and to Luxembourg, but these are modest relocations. Until now, at least, we have seen that London will remain the biggest European international financial center. And actually, the main threat I would see for London is not Brexit as such, but if due to Brexit and other political circumstances, London would lose its international openness. However, this is not foreseen, or actually the likelihood that this happens can be, the same question can be posed to Frankfurt or the European Union as a whole, given the political developments which also have been discussed in the last panel.
Well, but it seems that one of the developments that are already now coming out of Brexit is an increasing fragmentation of financial markets. You just mentioned the asset management goes to Dublin or to Luxembourg, and the banking goes to some degree to Paris, etc. this fragmentation is the opposite of what used to be the strength of the City of London, which is an extremely tightly knit network of skills, of know-how, and of people who know and trust each other. I mean, after all, on the entry doors to the Bank of England, it says, my word is my bond, and that is an issue of trust of people who know each other. If we fragment the financial industry in Europe, are we effectively undermining the capacity of Europe to be a financial player? It was mentioned earlier that Shanghai and Hong Kong and Singapore are actually already ahead in many ways and operations.
Well, I don't think that, well, first of all, it's clear when the global economy is growing, and as it has been also changing with regard to its distribution 30 years ago, Asia was in a very different situation economically than it is now, that we would also see a catching up in terms of finance. So therefore, I'm not surprised to see that we have observed the rise of these financial centers, also in relative terms, as we have seen the rise of emerging markets in terms of share in world GDP. I think in the beginning of the 2000s, it was that we for the first time had global GDP, the share of global GDP produced in emerging economies and developing economies was for the first time larger than in advanced economies. But this is a relative decline given the overall increase in GDP which we see on the globe as a whole. And therefore, actually, I would be worried with regard to this kind of fragmentation which you have mentioned. If we would have a decline in globalization, that actually is, in my view, actually the more threat to cities like London and also Frankfurt if we would have given the political dynamics which we have seen in the last couple of years, if this would actually threaten globalization, not only with regard to trade as we now see it, but also with regard to finance.
Mr. Scheiding, you are in charge of the British Chamber of Commerce in Germany for the Rhine-Main area. And in view of the discussion we've just had here, and if I take up what Mr. Winkler said, would you feel that the willingness of businesses and startups is there to pick up what Frankfurt's potential could be, or is it sort of the reality going to be much more boring and maybe less exciting than what these opportunities seem to promise?
Yeah, thanks very. Do you hear me? Thanks very much for the question, and thanks to Nader Maleki and his sponsors for inviting me here, first of all. And before I answer your question, I would give an example from last night. Some of you might saw the soccer game, Eintracht Frankfurt against Chelsea. I think that's a good example. Chelsea with its budget of more than 900 million in its portfolio. Frankfurt not even 10% of it, but you saw how tight it was. So passion also is a very important factor. And now I come to the answer. I think Frankfurt and the Rhine-Main region, but don't forget also the federational setup with Berlin and other major economical centers, either North Rhine-Westphalia, Hamburg, in the south, Munich, Stuttgart. They have learned to play this federational system. And I think the federal system is key to Germany and will be also key to the EU. Frankfurt itself has quite picked up thanks I would say, to the mayor's lobby under Mr. Feldman, you and others. They helped to bring Frankfurt on the, I would say, on the map as a completely different hub as it was, let's say, before the millennium. I myself came here 31 years ago from the north, from the city of Kiel, and I can tell you I was driven by car every day, every weekend. 600 kilometers back home to Kiel because it was so boring. Now I have to say Frankfurt became really, to me, the city with a lot of enthusiasm and a good field and ground for startups, fintechs and entrepreneur behavior. And this because of a very good work together with the local politicians, the industry, the financial, the real economy. Do not underestimate it, that the Rhine-Main region is much more powerful, as a lot of people know, also in Germany. And again, what we heard before, the willingness to build bridges with London. There was never ever the attitude from the beginning when Brexit was asked for that Frankfurt wants to copy London or replace. I think it's a completely wrong approach. We have to look on Europe as a time zone, not at our borders, to have a chance for the future generations. And the crowd who we want to obviously encourage to come here and build with us a meaningful third time zone among the globe. And therefore, I think Frankfurt can really cope and make it up with others. Surely just recently in the fintech industry, I would say since the past 3 years, you really feel it. But it's not worse as London. It's more, again, we have to work together here as a time zone, because so far the startup industry and the fintechs, when they are meaningful, they go to the valley, they go to Tel Aviv, because this is where the culture is, the understanding of how to support them, particularly in the third phase of money raising, when the really cash burner kicks in. Then it is important. And I see that we more and more adapt that into our society, working together in these magic part of between the obviously science side, the real economy, the financial sector, and not finally to forgotten the politicians as well. And if we do so, and we have a common understanding, not just between Frankfurt and London, Paris, Luxembourg is mentioned, and also Amsterdam. Mr. Oettinger said before, rightly so, we have to speak with one voice. We have to learn to overcome the competition among each other. When China asked for the chances in Europe to see renminbi offshore centers, it was unbelievable how everybody was fighting against each other. In the end, Frankfurt made the race of 3 days. Chinese were clever enough to play everyone and obviously get the best out of it. And what do we have in the end? If we don't stick together and learn more how to play our strengths, it is definitely what we need. And I see in Frankfurt a lot of good initiatives, also because it became a true, really open international cultural city.
You know, when I first moved to live in London in the early 1980s, you said that Frankfurt in those days was boring and you had to escape it. When I moved to London in the early 80s, there were exactly 2 places where I would get espresso and cappuccino. One was Bar Italia, which is still in Soho there. The other one was a coffee shop between Piccadilly and Leicester Square, run by Indian immigrants escaping from Uganda. That was it. Today, it's beating in terms of gastronomy, Paris or any other city in Europe. This is kind of innovation in terms of lifestyle that of course attracts. And I guess the price we have to pay in London is that we have traffic jams all the time, and you will probably get that in Frankfurt too. But it is also a sign that innovation is attracted and conglomerates with innovation and attractivity. I would like to ask a last question to Mr. Markovic. When you are looking at the broad world that is in your portfolio, if I may call it that way, and you said innovation is so important for these countries. Do you see that in those countries you have those kind of attractive hubs emerging? Or is it actually that the developed hubs, like Frankfurt, like London, are just feeding on each other and becoming stronger and stronger?
A combination of the 2 things. It's not by chance that Silicon Valley or London are becoming centers. It's the whole infrastructure thing, including, importantly, the link between the universities and businesses. But we do see centers emerging, and including with the attempts of certain governments to create such centers to better the links between the universities and businesses, and to create, shall I say, critical mass for smaller hubs innovation hubs, right, and so on. In particular, in our countries in Eastern Europe, we saw Sofia Innovation Park in Bulgaria coming up, and over last several years, increasing in impact. We also see that in some other non-European countries. It's not to the level of the UK and certainly not Silicon Valley, and it's hard to say whether it'll ever be. But what we see for sure is that we have a lot of good tech companies which started in Eastern Europe. Skype is one example, but there are other. UiPath, right, is a recent Romanian example, and so on. And we almost regularly saw in the past that as they come to the growth stage, so not the first stage is covered in Europe. As they come to the growth stage, they regularly move either first to London and then end up, like in Silicon Valley when they become very, very big and important. A part of it is ecosystem for sure. A part of it is also finances. So thinking about, I do agree with Mr. Winkler and other colleagues in Frankfurt. This part of the financing should remain global. There is no other way. What's for us to see is how to ensure that once companies leave Europe, they also come back, either provide the knowledge or act as a stimulator for the new startups emerging in the countries from which they left. If you take a look at how the US model works, the major funding sources for the new startups comes from previously successful startups, Bill Gates of the world and so on. So I'm always wondering whether we can replicate that model or whether in Europe we should actually seek some of the specific models involving more banks and so on into funding innovation.
So the snowball issue is obviously very important. You mentioned also that universities are important pillars in this whole development, and we're coming to the end of this very intensive and interesting day, for which I'm very grateful. Here at the LSE, we are, of course, one of the lighthouses of intellectual innovation. Not only that, some people say, oh my God, what will happen after Brexit? The foreign students will no longer come. I think nearly 60% of faculty of the LSE is actually continental European, and we are truly international university. But what is so interesting is that at the same time, especially with respect to European studies, this year our enrollment and applications for studying at the European Institute, European policies, have been up despite Brexit. So clearly quality works, and I'm very grateful for having had this opportunity to share and participate in this very innovative, truly innovative new way of doing conferences across 4 cities. So if I may just ask the director of the European Institute, which has chaired this particular issue here, if you would like to say a final word and maybe use the microphone here.
Could I jump in before you do that, because you may wish to address this issue as well. And that's the issue of linkages between British and German universities, which I think is a very interesting development. Maybe you all know more about it than I do, but I found out 2 or 3 weeks ago that Oxford is linking up with 4 universities in Berlin. I understand that Birmingham and Frankfurt universities are linking up, and I'd be very interested to hear from you when you address us what, if any, LSE's plans are in this direction.
So Simon Glemmerding is the director of the European Institute within the LSE.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It has been an extraordinary day. Frank Scheideg's remarks on the football did remind me that the Frankfurt scene from here does look a little bit like the post-match analysis of Champions League, with all the decorations behind you. It looks extraordinary. But actually it's a remarkable technological achievement, and it's a wonderful site. I think I should imagine in your room too, there are technical assistants around, and I'm sure we should also thank the people who've been helping us out today. On the immediate question of links between universities, it is worth saying that the European Institute, as well as a number of departments at the LSE, have double degrees for master's students in a number of places. The European Institute already has a double degree with Sciences Po in Paris, and starting up next year with Bocconi. And we're looking forward to further developments on those fronts. So that's very exciting, although we're also starting up with Fudan. So it's not only going to be Europe that we're going to be looking towards. Well, when I spoke this morning, I mentioned the great German thinker Immanuel Kant. I want to finish today with reflection on some words by a great French thinker, Paul Valéry. Paul Valéry was a poet and essayist. In 1919, when Europe had just made a first enormous attempt to destroy itself, he wrote an essay called The Crisis of Spirit. And he looked back at our history and commented that there are many what he called, for us, beautiful vague names of the past which have fallen into the abyss of history. And he said, it's deep enough to hold us all. Yeah. And Paris, London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, we can say one day these too will be beautiful vague names. However, he saw this awakening to our own mortality as a kind of challenge to us as well. It wasn't the end. In fact, when I heard the news of the Brexit referendum, which I have to say left me absolutely speechless at the time, I was in Brussels, in fact, on a European Research Council panel, and the wonderful young German chair said to me, "Oh, Simon, would you like to say something?" And I thought, how can I say anything at all right now? But I wrote on the board something from another great European, from Shakespeare, who said, in a line from King Lear, when actually King Lear is nearing his own death, he says, "The worst is not, so long as I can say, this is the worst." And that's because, of course, he's not dead yet. As long as you can say something, it's not all over. And so even if what you're saying is, this is the worst, that's not the worst. The worst can be avoided. And I think everybody who's been participating today across Europe, in Paris, London, Amsterdam and Frankfurt, show us the still beating heart of a European promise that is not exhausted. I don't know what's going to happen in my own country. It seems to be everyone in the dark. I mean, let's say that experts as well as ordinary citizens have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. But I do hope this is the worst. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Marvelous array of quotations.